My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, they swear skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
What, they don't want to listen to you?
No, they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They're just like, oh, here we go, Mark. Off again with your...
Mark being Mark again.
Yeah. So, that's the thing about podcasts is when you're on the air, and it's like therapy, If I can't talk to my family about this stuff, I'll talk to you, Matt, and all our listeners.
You'll just tell your whole podcast.
Yeah. So who are we talking about today, Matt?
They think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
Acquired a copy for their collection of the Emerald Tablet.
Really?
Yeah,
Huh.
so there's a handful of very good libraries that have it in their special collection. So
Yeah, I can imagine they're interesting people who are interested in it. The Getty family is certainly interesting.
right.
Okay. Well, Mr. Cotnoir, we're going to get rolling here.
Okay.
I have a bunch of questions for you, and it's a
Sure.
pleasure to have you here. For maybe our listeners who haven't heard of you before, can you give us a little bit of info on, who you are and what you've been up to in the past few years or so?
Sure. Past few decades. You're recording, yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. So what I do, I'm Brian Cotnoir, and my work basically is involved in researching alchemy, right? And alchemy, both materially, spiritually, I guess, inner work and things like this, and how that has meant different things over different times. Okay, so what I do is I attempt to go to the primary sources of alchemy, other texts, etc., work out a procedural process, and then attempt to replicate it. Once I have that replication, right, some things succeed, some things don't. It's practical alchemy in a sense.
I love
Then
it.
you go back and you reread the text. And from there you get some things that match with what you've done, and some things suggest other things. And then as you go, so this is an aspect of alchemy, that it is a dialogue. It's a dialogue attempting to understand creation. And then once understanding creation, what you might be able to do to manipulate it, to play with it, to move it to other stages.
Right. And I think often people get caught up in the theoretical alchemy and forget that there is that practical side, which is
Exactly.
why I'm excited to have you here and really dive into this topic in depth. Because although I've never practiced alchemy, I have played around with the theory quite a bit, and who knows, maybe accidentally practice some alchemy. But
Well, if you cook, you do, right?
great point. Yeah, cooking and even in the back of this book that I mentioned, Practical Alchemy by yourself, you have the herbal lore and their connections to each planet. I think that's a very important point. We don't want to get there just yet because,
Right, exactly.
as you know, this is the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I like to figure out who you were when you were younger and also, particularly on the point of alchemy, like what really sparked this in you? Because I heard you mention this on another podcast, and I have a very similar take, I guess. I can remember times in the library coming across very curious books about alchemy. So without me giving it away, how did you come across alchemy first?
It was really, it's actually funny, two things. One is, and this actually follows as I really studied alchemy, right? As I studied the history, traditions, things like this, my experiences actually mimic the two traditions that, like how alchemy was transmitted and was transmitted across borders. One is a textual tradition out of books that you read, and then you read other books. And the other one is um, a craft aspect of it, where the techniques and the materials are passed on and taught. So for instance, in alchemy, that gets played out with books being translated from Greek into Arabic, Arabic into Latin, this type of a thing. But then the other mode of transmission were the artists, were the artisans, which were working with these same processes, right? How do you make, basically, how do you make bronze look like gold? How can you mix copper and gold together so that it actually looks like full gold, right? Known as Corinthian gold. It's like used by early artisans. And so there's this material transmission that goes on, basically artist manual to artist manual, right? And that transmits into Europe in around 800 AD in an artist manual. Some of the early alchemical things that are traced back to Alexandria, Egypt, as well as there's a textual one. So my rumblings around in the library, I think if most people are listening to this, I think they will identify like with this raging sense of curiosity that I think a lot of us have and had, and especially kids have in abundance. But then I think folks who are drawn to this stuff, it's like have a little bit of extra of it. So after school each day, I'd kind of a nerd doing my homework, right? I'd go to the library, do my homework, so I would have time then to roam the stacks, right? And I found everything, just as you would, right? I was given an adult library card at an early age because I could read and kind of went through the kids section pretty quickly. But, and then I came across this book on alchemy, right? So a history, and I think it was by Titus Burckhardt. There's another one because there were two books that would have been published around that time, right? Kind of mid 60s. That would have been in the library because it is a history, but it actually is a really good one. And it annoyed me. I mean, this is the thing. When I read it, it was like, this is really annoying. At the same time, I kept coming back to it, and looking back on it as an adult, the way I think I would phrase it is, what I was seeing there. I had a strong interest in the sciences, and I had a strong interest in the arts. Many of my family like draw, paint, and I do that as well, although I don't call myself that necessarily. And that's kind of what, kind of got it all started. It was this. It seemed as if the book was this intersection of the two, which both fascinated me, but yet was impenetrable at the time. I mean, I'm like, what, 11 years old, 12 years old. This is in the adult section in the library. So there is a bit of that challenge. But at the same time, it was like not fitting, right? If you know what I mean. It's like it's art and it's science, but it seems to be, and that was, that was also the enticement of it for me. Was like, wow, here's something that kind of gets at this other kind of way of looking at the world. And it happened to fit with the kind of way I was looking at the world at that age, if you know what I mean.
Right. And
sort of like yeah.
Well, I was going to say, and quite possibly planted these seeds in the garden of your mind that, grew into all of these excellent things you've done. Now, where we're going next after this period, you're spending a lot of time probably wrestling with this in your head, but at some point, and I know this from a previous interview I've heard you on, you made your way into Weiser in New York City. Now,
oh yeah, because
I live not too far from there, and I just wanted to point out how.
Excuse me, you say you live not too far from there?
Well, from New York City. Weiser, as we both know, is no
Okay.
longer.
I was going to say, wow, are you around the block? It's like,
No. Yeah, they're
yeah,
no
yeah,
longer there, but going to New
no,
York City, and searching for used bookstores is one of my favorite things to do because
absolutely.
just the, millions of people that are there and have been
Yeah,
there, the
yeah,
possibilities are really limitless. So
totally.
when I found that out, I was like, oh, shoot, I missed Weiser in New York City. But I'm wondering, was it just circumstance or a little bit of what we call on the show synchromysticism,
Oh no, this was a
synchronicity?
plan.
Yeah.
Oh,
Tell.
this was a plan.
te-
This was because in those wanderings in the library, I would see who publishers were,
right, right,
and then it's like my penmanship was really bad in grammar school. So it's like I think about these people getting these letters and what they looked like, asking for their catalog. I mean, it was obviously I was 12 when I wrote for the first catalog from Weiser's, but I look at things. I have like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, okay? The first Dover edition that came out in the 60s or something like that. I have my name in it. It looks like it's printed by a 5-year-old in big block letters. That's what my handwriting was like. So I could imagine
I can
them
relate.
getting a letter from somebody, could you send me your catalog? And once I got the Weister's catalog, it was like, oh my God. It's like
Yeah,
everything. I've got to go there someday. And then that was it. I started going, and there was the first book was the volumes of Paracelsus, translated by Arthur Edward Waite. It's a 2-volume set of the Hermetic and Alchemical writings of Paracelsus, and it was like, someday you will be mine.
yeah.
And then I
Wow.
did. I worked summer stuff, did things, hustled, whatever. Got the $35 together, which was quite, and bought it. And then I'm like, okay, this is like reading concrete. When you bang your head against that for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that was it. So it was intentional because I knew, like seeing what was on the bookshelf
Now,
and then knowing that there's a basement, it was like I got to get myself in the basement.
right, right. And
So
before we get into that a little bit, I'm wondering because I've run into this same thing with the concrete, and
yes,
it's a mix of things, but I'm wondering, what alleviates that for you? Is it getting your head in the mindset of that person and how they would have wrote at that time? Is it context, other, maybe peers that were writing as well during that time? What are some strategies to sort of get through that
sure.
thick, dense stuff?
And basically, it's yes to all of the above. I mean, it is really, it really is patience. There's a book from the late 17th century called the Mutis Liber. It's the silent book because there's almost no words in it. It's just a series of images. Except at the very end, where they have succeeded, they have their fingers on the lips going, okay, we just showed it to you all, but shh, right? And what it says is ora et labora, right? Lege, 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 re lege et inviernis, right? So it's like pray and work, right? Then read, right? Read, and then reread, and you will discover.
Right.
And so what that really is, I found in anything I apply, like learning something from reading, the basic strategy I use is I don't really try to understand it the first time I read it, right? In other words, what I do is I just read it. I just make sure I say all the words and I get to the end. And there's a certain amount of that you will understand, right? And then what that does, without you resisting it or trying to analyze it, like what do they mean here? It's just what you had said at first. You get yourself accustomed to the author's voice. And so this is a way of doing that, right? By just reading it you try to understand it. I mean, you got to give a little effort, but it's not the thing where you stop and you try to hammer it out right then and there.
Right.
Because one of the things that goes on too with this work is sometimes in the next paragraph or two is just the way this author discourses is they take a while to get to their punchline kind of a thing.
Mm.
But in about 2-3 paragraphs, what's puzzling you is answered, right? Whereas if you stop, you're just circling, 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 and then you go, oh shit, there it is, right?
Right.
So that also just kind of lets you ease in to the language, and the language of alchemy can be quite dense. And this is from experience, so just take it as you will. There's a tendency when you first approach it to overinterpret it, to go like, oh, this means that, that means this means this. I would say hold off on that. I mean, you'll get to that point. Really, it is just a get through the first reading and just, as I say all the words and get to the end. And then, let it sit for a while and then go back to it. And that's the point. The second reading for me is where then I will struggle over things. Okay, what do they mean by this? And maybe in the interim before rereading it again, I now have a sense of the voice, the time period, who this is. So maybe I might read some of the philosophy that adjoins this time period. Maybe I might read some of the theological references that seem to be in this text. So I start to try to give another broader context around it that will give insight into some of the language, because a lot of the language that's used in these, it's in the air, right? It's not like, I mean, the use of icon and images in 16th century, 15th century, it's, at the sign of the dog, that's where you go drinking. You know what I mean? It's nothing, it was a mode, right? Early emojis in a way.
Right.
It's not an unusual kind of a language in a sense. So it is this kind of a thing. I don't know where I'm going with this, but
Well, no.
reading of the text, yes. So the other layer is once you get through the second one, right, and struggle with it, this is where you really, really, really try to get it. But if it's still resisting, acknowledge it and then move on, right? And then once you get through the second one, what you do is you let some time evolve, read some other things around it, and even other experts, other interpretations, other whatever it might be. And then you come back to it and read it a third time, and you read it sort of a third time, kind of straight through. When you hit those places that were knotty, what I do is I just sit with it for a little bit. In other words, you know how it is when you try to untangle a small chain that's knotted? It's like you don't pull, you just kind of like play with it and get it to relax.
Massage it, yeah.
This type of a thing.
Right.
And sometimes it opens up, sometimes it doesn't. So what, again, you do is consciously go, okay, I don't know that. I don't have an answer for that. I'm not going to say yes. I'm not going to say no. I'll just put that aside for now, right? But you've made a conscious choice to do that, and you've identified, and then you move on.
Right.
And then if it's an alchemical work, like a laboratory work, at some point that knot, you do have to make an interpretation. You just have to go, okay, as I see this, it could be pointing to 3 different things, right? And you go, all right, let's try number 1. Okay, so this is what I mean. You make a commitment to that. You've interpreted, you've read it, you've come to an understanding. And this is what alchemy then does. Tests it in the world, right? It's like whatever you think you're doing, a material thing, spirit, what have you, you put it into the world. The sacred is enacted in the profane. This is alchemy.
Right.
And so that's what you do. Then the next step of the reading is exactly that. Put it into action and then try it out. Read against it, what the book says and what the actual results are. How much of that is operator error? How much of that is malinterpretation? How much of that is hidden materials in, oh, you now are into the hall of mirrors, right? But that's where it's the work that kind of grounds it, right?
Right.
And so that's what's also important in the reading. And this is what I mean by a dialogue. I mean, you can read the text, but it will only really gain meaning if you engage the text.
Right. Now, how much of this engagement process involves aura or prayer? Because that is one of the first sections of the theory section of the book, and
Exactly.
I feel like in my own pursuits and studying this stuff, the times when I sort of surrendered to not knowing with a
Mm-hmm.
question,
Exactly.
whatever happened in series of time afterwards, the answer came, and
Right.
it felt like prayer was the factor involved. So can you expand on that a little bit for
Yeah.
us?
Yeah. And I think you can even open up even more, because prayer has a specific image in mind of supplication and asking it and all these things, which is also correct and true. But it's also, just as you said, it's like it's an opening up of a pathway of reception, if you will, right? It's like you're kind of getting out of your own way. It can be, you can conceive of it as meditation, prayer, what have you. What's interesting in that work I was referring to, the Mutus Liber, it is one of the key phrases. The few things that are written in it is this phrase, ora et labora, right? Pray and work. And the whole process in this book of images shows a couple working through and making the philosopher's stone, essentially. Okay, and it's often referred, oh, this is a couple, right? This is a man and a woman working together. So this is really about the inner work of the alchemist unifying with the projection of the anima as a female alchemist, and the whole process here is about that sort of balancing. And that's kind of a contemporary Jungian psychological interpretation of it. Two things that are going on there. One is, at that time period, this was a thing. There were partners, couples. This was the new medicine that was being made. And so there was a lot of changes that were going on in medicine, and the accessibility of doing these alchemical works, which were medicinal works. It's a really surprising explosion of this kind of activity. So what's being depicted in here isn't really unusual, right? Like, here's just like a, for instance, a little aside, right? Robert Boyle, right, the father of chemistry, right? Well, he had a laboratory. His older sister had a laboratory, right? Because she was doing alchemical experiments and chemical experiments as well, and she let her younger brother, right, little Bobby, come on over and use her lab, right? So it's this very dynamic atmosphere, in a sense, where this work is going on. So it is depicting physical work, but the ora and labora, that saying goes back, I forget whose rules it was, 6th century monastic rules about work and prayer, right? And so this becomes an aspect of doing the great work, right? Which is this meditative aspect, right? A prayer aspect, an opening aspect, but something that needs to be grounded in work. And what this particular book, Mutus Liber, is showing that process as to how to best integrate those two things, right, is another interpretation. So it's showing a material process, but it's in that material process plus this meditative thing that goes on that enables the changes to happen, like psychically, spiritually, what have you.
Right.
So this is the ora and labora, and you see this in images. Like in the 17th century, there's a very famous engraving. I'm trying to think of the name of the alchemist, Kircher, I think it might be.
Athenius Kircher?
Yeah, and I think it's a tent, and you see the alchemist praying, and then you see that this sort of tent, this oratory, is in part of a much larger room, which is indeed a laboratory. So again, you have this idea of a space where you will contemplate and meditate what you're doing, as well as a place of doing, and
Right.
that the two, it just, and this is the thing with alchemy, right? The Emerald Tablet is a sort of a root text of this. And one of the things that it indicates is the fact that in one of the lines, one of the later lines of it, it says the thing about like, well, as the macrocosm was created, so is the microcosm, like the less of the great work, or basically your work here. Other phrases within the text suggest that, well, just as all things come from the one, right? So this work is that same way. So what's suggested there is that really any creative work can be the basis for this kind of a meditation, alchemical meditation, if you will. It's just a question of finding that harmony of, or how these things link up to stages almost, because alchemy unfolds in changes expressed through color, expressed through, wherever it is. So you have to find that in your own work, so to speak, to kind of find that. But this is one of the things that it alludes to, is that any material work, right, can be ritual. Some of this, it's the idea of being able to do something that creates something that has an impact that causes a change.
Right.
And that's alchemy. And that's also, there's a phrase within the Emerald Tablet, right? This is the secret of talismans, right? But that word, it has a meaning of originally of a performance, a ritual, a something that ends in a result that has an impact, which is what we understand talismans to be, right? It's sort of engraved, written on, but its point is not its own creation in and of itself, but to effect a change. And this is what the Emerald Tablet speaks of. And this is what alchemy says. It's like, you perfect something to its absolute perfection, it can turn around and itself perfect.
Right. I talk about this sometimes on the show. I make these wire wraps here, and
Wow.
when you're describing that, it really brings to mind that process, because it's extremely meditative, as many art forms are, but I find that these are talismans the way you're describing them.
Absolutely.
There's a purpose, there's an intention, and obviously with a crystal there's all sorts of associated energies too.
Have you ever read Proclus on the sacred art?
No, but that
It's a
sounds like something I
Neoplatonic.
would be.
Oh, I think you might, because
Yeah.
the Neoplatonic writings, like sort of 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, really all deal with this aspect, right, of kind of a union with the one, an ascent of the soul. And alchemy does it through its material processes by activating that kind of inner working, so to speak. But other means, as well. And I mentioned, like, okay, ritual is sometimes one of the Neoplatonic practices. Was this thing called the animation of statues? Okay, and the thing is, what you would Iamblichus, in a work called On the Mysteries, kind of outlines a lot of this material work. What the Neoplatonists viewed was that, well, God is everywhere, right? Iamblichus takes it further and says, well, just as, everything is permeated with everything, well, there are things that are solar, right, such as the sun, but some of those solar things are also here on Earth, like gold or amber, sunflower or rosemary. And as you're wanting to build a channel to the gods, you can assemble these things, okay? And as you're assembling it, you are actually activating this sort of, the geometry that they represent is being assembled, and it starts to activate the geometry of your soul, which is a mirror or an exact, whatever of a larger geometry of the greater soul, so to speak.
Right.
And then with the Iamblichus, I think it's he who says this, is like when you bring these things together, it's not the God. All that's missing, it's like sulfur needs the flame, right? Everything's there and ready to ignite. And that part comes from you. This part comes from your active imagination, in a sense. You kind of engaging this, and this opens up. And as the Iamblichus says, the gods don't descend to us. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, you may make the statue, and you may be calling the spirit of the god into it. And it's like, but no, that's not what happens here. It's us who goes to them. But it's through this kind of material work that opens up this channel. And you see this still alive in like early Christian Byzantine Christianity, the work with icons, the incense, I mean, everything is to open up this channel. And if you read some of the writings of some of the philosophers around that time, of some of the empresses praying to an image of Mary, and the image starts to cry. Speaking I mean, it gets some pretty intense stuff, but it continues on, that idea,
Right.
ensouling matter. And
I
so your work, what you just showed me, is very much that. This is a talisman. I don't know what your intent was. I don't know what you were meditating on, but their idea would be that somehow is part of this assemblage. Right? It kind of resonates within there, to use a word, even if it may not be a material resonance, if you know what I mean.
right. And
Anyhow, so this is a way one could work.
right? Absolutely. And what's coming to mind is this process of almost emulating the creator through being a creator yourself. And
That's
as
exactly
you
it.
kind of put with Iamblichus, you know, you sort of attune yourself to the right frequency by having, you know, all of these different components that would sort of open that channel up. Wow.
Right. Yeah. And that's exactly it. It's, you know, it's the creator thing, you know. And I mean, I was raised, you know, Catholic, and what you always hear is like, oh, well, God, you know, made man in his image. And it's like, well, in that sense, yeah, we create something out of nothing,
Right.
you know. We can make sounds, and, you know, make people laugh, make people cry, make people make the same sounds with me, right? Get people to sing along, kind of a thing. It's like, it's amazing what we can make out of nothing, right? Or what seems to be nothing. There's always some kind of a substrata there.
Right.
But that goes back to the very early Greek philosophers. A teacher of Socrates, her name was Diotima. And in one of the dialogues, she's quoted as saying, it's like, anyone who makes something out of nothing is a poetes, right? Is a poet. But what she's saying is really a composer. And that's what the word comes down to. But the word for alchemy is the same word, right? So anyone who makes something out of nothing is an alchemist. It's
Right.
kind of how you could also, if you wanted to push the translation, yeah, better to say a maker, right? Or a composer, because that's what alchemy does. It breaks something down into its elements, right? And then recomposes it. And this is what a poem does. Takes elements, in Greek, the same word, stoichia, right? For grammar elements and material elements, you rearrange that, and we have the language of matter, you know?
Right. And it seems like this language of matter has almost gotten ahead of itself to the point where now people take that model of understanding the universe and apply it past the model to what now they think they're separate. But really, I think the true value in what you so brilliantly said here today is that all of the elements are inside of us. That's what makes this microcosm, macrocosm exchange possible.
Right.
So there is no separation.
There is. I mean, there is and there isn't. That's the thing. I mean, you know, yes, we are here. I'm Brian. You're Mark. There's a computer. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, I don't pay my bills. If electricity will go off. You know, there is. But yes, that's exactly it.
Right.
This is what alchemy does. It kind of brings you so deep into a vision of like matter, reality, construction, that you kind of come out the other side. Right. It's just as you would in physics, right? If you just keep on going layer after layer after layer, it kind of gets pretty empty down there. And then you realize, okay, what's going on? You know, the same in the opposite direction. There's
Right.
an image in alchemy out of a manuscript called the Splendor Solis, one of the most magnificent ones. If you look this up and you go to the British Library, they have it fully digitized, and you can get really close up on it. Quite beautiful. And there's, I think it's plate 12. There's what's known as a rebus, a two-headed character with wings. It's part of the process. One hand is holding an egg, the other hand is holding a shield. And the shield is a representation of earth, water, air, fire, and then implied is what goes beyond, and then the egg. And what the text is also speaking of is how, okay, these are the 5 elements: fire, air, earth, water, and space. And it's speaking of both creation, and then anytime you see an egg, it both represents the beginning as well as the end. It can be the philosopher's stone or the elements that will go into making it. But the text says that the outer shell represents earth. There's a layer of water, then there's a thin membrane of air, then of fire, and then within, deep within, basically the chick, the little blood clot of that they say is the ether, and then beyond. So they have this vision of matter in the sense that just as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, you enter into this eternity, right? And then the same thing they're saying on the macrocosmic level, where we're standing right now, is earth, water, air, fire, and then it opens up and then eternity. So really what you have between these two eternities is this thin foam of constantly evolving, churning matter, right? And that's what alchemy explores. It's an ascent through descent. It's an attempt to reach through that kind of vision of unity through understanding sort of the emptiness of matter, as it were.
Right.
And so when you are working, it's not just a question of like wanting to make a compound, wanting to make a result. Well, that's what the tests are. It's more like, okay, what are you really seeing? What is really going on here, right? And that gets you to start thinking about things differently. The other thing that happens is the more you start to do something, the more it starts to show up in your dreams. And then that's where things get interesting. This is where the inner work starts to show up and point in another direction.
Right.
And that's the other benefit of doing a material work. It grounds your mind in something concrete. And the more you do something, the more you start to dream it. And
Right.
some of these dreams will help solve a problem in the lab or in your life or what have you. And other ones will suggest a deeper way, kind of like knock on that door of ascent, if you know what
Right.
I mean.
Now, when it comes to the healing process, you
Mhm.
mentioned medicine, but I think it's important to ask for clarification's sake that, what was intended to heal, the process itself or the, potion that was created as a result of the
Oh,
process? It seems like the process itself is more of the
probably
intended.
for the individual
Hmm.
can be seen that way, but actually no. What a lot of this alchemy was, particularly as you get later and later,
Hmm.
right? It's an interesting, this is like a over generalization. But generally what happens when alchemy is first introduced into the next culture, as the translations come in, is, holy shit, you can make gold for real,
Yeah.
right? You got that technology? Okay, let's get cracking. And so you see the early translations read like chemistry books once you understand the language, right?
Hmm.
Then starts to come, well, no, this is also part of the older traditions, is no, it's all about the pursuit of wisdom, right? The closer we can understand the creator's mind through creation, the closer we come to the creator, right? And then, as always, from the beginning and even in the older stuff, there is this medicinal aspect of it, that really what you're talking about in any way is the healing of the material world. So lead is really just a very sick gold. Okay, is one way of seeing it. And what the philosopher's stone would do would being health and balance again, because health was an idea of the balance of four elements, humors in the human body, the four elements in matter. So this is what the stone would bring that. If you were sick, you could take a little bit in wine, what have you, and your humors would immediately balance, right? If you were spiritually troubled, it would do the same thing. So there's different aspects. Some of it is, dead on material, right? And so that's the part that that you really can replicate and you actually can do. I don't remember exactly what your question was that led into those three kind of definitions, but medicine, right? Medicine was always there. When they are speaking about healing, they are speaking about making something that will heal. I mean, that is across the board. There is the sense of as I just said, sort of a spiritual healing as well is also implied within that,
Right.
as well as healing poverty. Right? And I don't mean that to see, it was the idea of, well, now, and you'll even hear them say this will also cure poverty. Shit, yeah, I make some gold, that cures my poverty,
Yeah. Just yours. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but is this idea though in the early writing, in every writing, is that this, you don't keep it. Right? That gold that you made is to be used for, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, underwriting orphanages, things like this. And you'll see writings of early alchemists that will say, yeah, we made the Philosopher's Stone twice, and out of this we were able to make so many pounds of gold, and we established an orphanage, we did this thing for old people, and we built the church.
Right.
In Indian alchemy, there's a text that says, the way you test if your medicine is pure, that all the poison of mercury has been removed, is you take some iron and you put the medicine on it, and if it transmutes it into gold, the medicine is good. And now you have gold. What do you do with that? So you are allowed to keep 10% to help pay for the costs of your lab. The rest has to be given away. The rest has to feed and clothe, right? Otherwise, you're on dodgy karmic ground.
Right.
What are you doing this for? It's not for the money. Granted, you have expenses, so take a little for yourself for that, but the rest goes out. And this is something you see throughout alchemy. So you get a sense that it's not just this, what power, what money, what secret knowledge can I get that the other kids don't have, but it's like, what understanding and what ethical open way can I turn this around to heal, cure, uplift, what have you, the world, community, family, what have you around you.
Right.
And that's the thing you do find in real alchemy, whatever form it takes, right? Is it should be at the heart of it. And that's like kind of like a smell test of it. It's like, what are they really doing this for?
Well, and that selflessness, I'm so glad you pointed it out, because I feel like the skeptical angle on this topic, they always plunge in with the, well, you can't actually turn lead to gold. And honestly, I don't find that even relevant to the conversation, but I think
finish. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah.
I think the real point is that, there is this sort of selflessness, this divine providence even component that the disbeliever will just, inherently never experience, because they're coming to the table with the wrong, frequency.
Right. But even if they had that same idea, they're still missing the point, right? Because even the early alchemists go, well, what we're talking about when we say gold is not the gold of ordinary people. We are talking about philosophical gold that has been made through this process of meditation and philosophy, pursuit of wisdom, right? And when you end up with this, I mean, there's a very early text, Zosimos of Panoply, right? 3rd century, 4th century AD, around Alexandria, right? It's basically what we know of a lot of early alchemy is from his writings. He had a partner, Theosebia. And there's as most of that stuff at the time, a lot of it is dialogue, right? So-and-so says this, it's like kind of a debate, instruction, these kinds of things. And one of the questions she asks is, why do we keep this such a secret? Right? Why do we keep this, what we do here, like so other people don't understand? And his basic answer is, first of all, there's a lot of people out there that are idiots that'll never understand what we're doing and think we are actually making real gold, but we're not. We're making philosophical gold. And he goes, if we said what we were doing, they would think it would be just like glass making, right? In other words, that what they are really engaged in is a known craft. There's glass making aspects to it. So what they're saying is, if you looked at it from the outside, and this is true, I think when like experiments I've replicated in making alchemical silver and making alchemical gold, you do end up with stuff that's like silver on the outside, copper on the inside. There's a way, it's called depletion gilding now. But there's a way you go through these stages of decomposition where the stuff is in the piece of equipment. We're not visual here, but it's sort of a circulatory thing. There's liquid on the bottom, solid up top, the liquid evaporates, dissolves the solid, and there's this process that replicates what's said in the emerald tablet. So there's a process going on, there's a material process going on, but they did not think they were actually making the gold of ordinary people. Right? They were making philosophical gold. Were they doing a material process that ended up with something that, if you do really carefully, really is gold, like gold on the outside, right? Pliny talks about this in Natural History, about how the gates of one of the 7 gates of Jerusalem was actually fabricated with this thing called Corinthian gold. And that's the process, 10% silver, 25% gold, and the 65% copper.
Right.
Mix those together, uses pickling, takes out everything except the gold on the surface. You burnish it, it looks like gold, except like a third the weight and like a tenth the cost, right? Now you tell me what artist isn't interested in that, right?
Right.
And I'm saying this is the grounding of it. But at the same time, you bring it through these processes, it follows this philosophical one. It follows the Nag Hammadi Apocryphon of John, of this ascent and descent into Hades to free the imprisoned bodies. There's these connections that go on there that speak of it as this integrated process. So you're right, someone looking at it and go, yeah, they think they're going to make gold with these ideas. And it's like, well, first of all, you can make gold with these ideas, meaning that the universe as we see is made up of substrata and particles. You just maybe can't do it with vinegar and lead, right? You might need some higher energies to kind of get it going, if you know what I mean. Right. But the theory and the concept is there.
Right.
And that's why, like Isaac Newton and Boyle, they were true believers. So much so, well, they just showed it didn't work with vinegar and lead kind of a thing. But they laid the foundation for what would actually cause transmutations.
And this is something that I think, most people just don't understand, is that the modern, brilliant, genius, inventor, thinker, philosophers, all of these great scientific minds of the past 600 or so years were very curious in alchemy. It was only up until maybe pre-World War I and II that they kind of stopped that interest, at least on the mainstream level, because I know there are plenty of people who probably kept it going, at least in the privacy of their own homes.
Right. As a, I don't know. It's like, I think it enables it then to get back to its own kind of like pure philosophical meditative self, if you know what I mean. Because really at this heyday of like the 17th century, it really is major discoveries of, industrial national importance. Okay. Right. Like for example, one of the great alchemists of Germany in the 1600s, Rudolf Glauber. Okay. One of the processes I believe it's him, if not, it's some other German alchemist around there, but it's like him who industrializes it, is the making of potassium nitrate. Okay. Saltpeter, key ingredient for gunpowder. Okay. Kaiser's interested. You're going to get full support for your lab now, right? So he realizes kind of early on in the work that transmutation isn't really happening, right? But all these other things are. So how do you do this? Before that time period, you wanted saltpeter, you wanted potassium nitrate, you had to have a lot of horse stables. And it was this process of harvesting and extracting. You can do it, but here all of a sudden you have this thing where you can kind of synthesize it out of almost nothing. Yeah. So this is kind of going on. Some of the key alchemists in England, you read what they're up to, they're also investing in mines of lead and antimony. It's like, okay, if we can make gold, get a corner on the lead and the antimony market, right? So there's this real burgeoning of sort of industry, 1700s. I mean, national competitions of the bloodiest kind, and each one trying to get an edge on each other.
Right.
And now you have this cutting edge science, right?
Well,
so there's everything going on here. So that's where it's, to me, it's one of the more fascinating times, but it really starts splitting out into clearly what's going to interest the greater minds in this are going to be the problems of physics, of chemistry, of engineering, of those kinds of things that are going to bring it forward, right? Because that's what's going to get the support.
Right.
The mystics and the dreamers, the artists, they'll continue on, you know, they'll visit us.
Well, what's so fascinating is in New England, you know, I'm from Connecticut, live in Connecticut, been here my whole life. And one of the things that I found so fascinating, and I heard this on a podcast many years ago, and it stuck with me, and I didn't really find any information to add up until this year. But I heard that there was a governor of Connecticut who was an alchemist, right? And I forgot the name, but I found out
Winthrop,
this year,
I think.
John Winthrop Jr. And he
I
was
believe that's correct.
And he was a big reason why the witchcraft trials stopped in Connecticut, where they were some of the most brutal in comparison to Massachusetts, because he had a lot of knowledge about the philosophy of alchemy. And he said, show me the magic that these witches are doing. He was kind of like laughing the whole way, because he's like, this isn't real magic.
There's a rationality. There's a rationality that's involved in alchemy. I mean, it's not just hooky pooky, I make whatever up and and then it gets, you know, no. There's a real, it is science. I mean, the earliest writings on alchemy say, it's like, here's the materials, right? I set them before you. I identify them so you'll have no mistake. Here is the process. If you do what I do, you will get the same result.
Right.
This is one of the cornerstones of science, is like reproducibility and a so-called transparency of like process and material. This text claims to be transparent because it's a written transcript of a dialogue between two people. One is showing the other the work, and the other one is just, you know, so we don't see it and hear it, but the people involved. Here is the work. This is what we call this. This is what we call that. Right? So it always had this kind of a rational thing. So I'm not really surprised that somebody who practices it, because it's not magic, right? It works with a natural philosophy that at the time they called natural magic, that evolves into engineering and science. It was like, how do you explain a magnet? Right.
Well, and it goes back to Arthur C. Clarke's famous quote about any, you know, technology sufficiently advanced appears to be magic to those not advanced enough, or something along those paraphrased lines.
How am I conjuring your image into my living room?
Exactly.
Oh, I contacted Zoom, the great Zoom. I said certain passwords, and there you are, you know.
Exactly.
This is magic, but that's exactly it. The conjuration of spirits, the giving of words, and then the connection, and we'll banish each other. You know?
Well, in the case of John Winthrop Jr., as you said, you know, the methodology behind his practice informed him to a level where he wasn't persuaded by the superstitions of the Puritans in his colony. And the reason why he loved the Connecticut colony when he first came to it was because there was there's a high concentration of mica in the soil, which at that time they thought might lead to silver mines, which it didn't, unfortunately for him. But yeah, he did end up kind of claiming a lot of Connecticut for the British until the war settled that. And it's just so fascinating to find out that this guy was an alchemist and so close to home.
there's a lot in early American history, because you could do, if you look at Harvard, um, look at their dissertations from the 1600s, a lot of the dissertations in philosophy, natural philosophy, these kind of things are on the philosopher's stone, reasons why it can be done, and then someone takes their PhD, their doctorate on that's their thesis, and this is what they argue. There was an alchemist out of the Americas, was born in Bermuda, I think went to Harvard, and then went to England. His name is George Starkey. And he was Robert Boyle's assistant, right? Except it was Starkey who was really kind of teaching Boyle his chemistry. Now, Starkey was also writing books under a pseudonym, Irenaeus Philolates, an anonymous lover of truth. And he was talking about the great work. Now, Boyle at this point is really believing that in the great work. And if he really works hard and demonstrates that he's working hard, the adepts will get wind. And the adepts will show up and teach him. This is what he believes. He really believes in this adept philosophy of you do the work, they're out there, they'll come and they'll teach you. And all the while he's doing this work, trying to do it, being taught by Starkey, who he thinks is just, a very smart lab assistant from the colonies, but is actually the guy writing these texts that he's trying to figure out. It's just brilliant.
Right.
But he's an American, it's an American alchemist in England. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
But this is the thing. It's not a university topic, but at the same time with medicine and in philosophy, you'll see debates around it because it is questioning the universe. It's like, does the universe work this way? Can matter change from one thing to the other? What are the reasons for that? Show me some experiments. And that's what really picks up 17th century, is that you can start doing experiments. You start having instruments that you can, really measure things, or stuff's left over that doesn't, alchemy says, or like a medicinal alchemy says, anything's made up of, mercury, sulfur, and salt, right? So a plant, for instance, its sulfur is an essential oil. The spirit is an alcohol that's fermented by it, and the salt comes from the body. You burn the plant, you get the ash, and you remove the salt. So now you have, right,
the three component parts of anything. Yeah.
But if you do that, right, so you take the essential, so you do a steam distillation of essential oil. So in the receiving flask you have water with some other things in it. You can smell it, you can taste it, and on top of it, it is floating, like, say, rosemary oil, for instance. Remove the rosemary oil, and you have that body of water there that's called a hydrosol, right? Alchemy, you don't need that. You could throw it, right? But everybody who does herbalism goes, well, wait a minute, there's some good stuff in here. And then alchemy adapts later and goes, well, okay, no, this is really the sulfur of water. And so all of a sudden now, well, all right, well, what is this then? If you said there were three principles, but now there are three principles of each principle, and all of a sudden now you're starting to break down matter and you're running out of names. And then, some people start to notice a pattern of how these things react with each other. You notice every time you use one of these, you need two of these. And then someone starts to figure out the periodic table, like what's going on. And then that becomes a puzzle. So you're not so much interested in, you are interested in changing lead into gold, but you think, well, if I solve this puzzle first, I can do it.
Right. Yeah, you essentially giving yourself something to do to make the money come in. I mean, that's turning lead to gold.
And you're doing it. But then at the same time, you're making these real material discoveries that are getting you a further understanding of it. Even if you may be thinking, just around the corner, I'm going to have the secret for turning lead into gold. And it does. It comes around with, what's his name? Ernest Rutherford in the teens, right? First atomic kind of does a transmutation, I forget, of oxygen into nitrogen or nitrogen into oxygen by bombarding it with something. And it's like, he doesn't want to, you read the essay he writes on this, it's kind of funny because he says, I don't want to use transmutation. I'll be laughed out of the profession. He goes, but what else do you call it? What else do you call it? Here's an element that once was, is no longer is, and this other element is there. I
Right.
did this to do it. You do it, you could do it too. You know what I
Right.
mean? And off we go. You know, Nuke Hiroshima, and it's like off.
Well, and so many people point to that moment in history as maybe a possible case for all the weird UFO, paranormal strangeness that's occurred since. I personally think that that stuff's been going on for a long time, but it is, reality. You're playing with the
Mhm.
fabric of reality when you do something like that. I mean, hydrogen
Right.
is the first element because it has just
Sure.
one proton. It's supposedly, the, I guess, the imminent,
Oh yeah,
precursor to
yeah.
every other
It's
element.
the building block of it all. I
Right,
mean, you don't go anywhere unless you got that first, and that's everywhere.
right.
You start playing with that. It's where all every element, as you probably know by now, every element in your body was once in a star. I mean, that's like, you know, think about how many cycles of stars that has to go through there to creep up to the elements, because each one is this first, kind of an assembly line of stuff. So you get helium, and then it keeps going,
Right.
and then it boom, blows it out across the universe. It starts coalescing, and here we are.
Yeah.
It's pretty something.
Well,
But yeah.
I wanted to bring up a show I do called the Elemental Philosophorum, where a buddy and I, we go
Hmm.
through different elements and we try to find, maybe some odd, strange history associated with that element. And
Hmm.
one thing that we found when looking into cobalt was that the German word for cobalt also means goblin. And
Yes.
I'm like, that's so interesting. That they must be running into goblins when they're mining or something,
Uh-huh. Or um, I think there might be a deeper root that they're
Tell us.
playing with. But this is what I find, like, and this is another element of the naming of like art materials,
Mm,
right? The naming of the materials used in alchemy um, will sometimes show their origins and the path that they traveled. And that's sometimes useful if you're working and trying to figure out an alchemical process. It's really good to try to find some artist manuals from that time period, and just kind of cross-reference things. You'll find descriptions that will line up, that will start to fill in. Um, because some of the stuff is, oh, mythically inflected, let's say. And what I mean by that, they'll say, take the best copper from Cyprus, right? Do you really need to go to Cyprus to get the best copper? Or can you get a best copper from Arizona that has some really good copper as well? And it's like, well, mythically, you kind of want Cyprus because that's where Venus first stepped on ground, right? So mythically, it has a deeper kind of mythic connection. Maybe in the Renaissance, this was a source of really good copper that you could work with. But the point is, you can still work with good copper. So reading it, you can start to break through kind of the mythic layers. You can work with those mythic layers should you choose, like, well, you know what, I want it from Cyprus where Venus steps, because it's got some extra mojo there. This is Aphrodite, this is the metal of Aphrodite, so sure, why not have it where she manifested?
mm.
um, so this is the thing, but you can still work alchemically with copper from Arizona, let's say.
Well, on that point, I'd like maybe if we could to elaborate on how each of the major alchemical metals got associated with their respective planets, because
Mhm.
we've kind of been saving those elements for later on in the series when we have a little bit more information and
Oh,
because those seem like they'll garner more interest mythologically and whatnot. But how did
absolutely.
they get associated with planets in the first place?
Very, very, very early on. I mean, it's some of the earliest, and they shift, except the ones that don't. And it's really interesting. Mercury is all over the place. Mercury gets associated with, and you go, well, of course, it's Mercury. It's a slippery little sucker, and but not just the metal. It does get identified with something called electrum, which is a mix of silver and gold and copper. It forms naturally, but it is a mix of the metals. And so sometimes that's associated with it. Early Greek early Greek material, early Greek writings associate the metals with the planets. And it's like gold is always silver. I mean, gold is always the sun, silver is always the moon, right? And it just, I think anybody could go, oh yeah, right? You know what I mean? There's something about it that you say that, I don't know, it'd be interesting to go around the world and just at random hand somebody like a disc of gold, a disc of silver, and ask them, which is the sun, which is the moon, you know? I think you'll find that. I think there's that. Whether you would hand a disc of tin and they'd say Jupiter is another question. But it comes very early on, right? And like iron being Mars, right? And Mars was known as the god of war, and the surface of Mars is red. The literal is iron oxide, right? So it is iron. It's just all these kinds of things that really
Right.
do
And they have all of this
line up
iron that
very early. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry to cut you off, but they have all this
No.
iron that falls from the sky that then they would take and turn into daggers and call daggers from heaven. You ever hear of the meteoric iron?
Yeah.
Right.
The Damascus steel.
Exactly.
This is one of our first findings as humans was in the desert, the meteorite falls. They'd find the iron and it's like, whoa, okay, pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
You know, that fell from here, you know, that's pretty impressive.
But you point out the
gotta be
iron oxide on Mars, it's uncanny. It's almost
Yeah.
to the degree of the Dogon people identifying Sirius B before they ever had a telescope. It's like, well, how did you know that, you know?
Yeah. Well, some of the theory on that is that it was a lot brighter a long time ago. And
Okay.
that has kind of kept up with the oral tradition and knowledge that it's there, kind of a thing.
Okay.
But, you know, as a kid, if you ask me where I was from, I would point to the Pleiades.
Right on.
It's like, I'm not from here. Where are you from? I'm from there. Just waiting to go home. Just, you
Yeah.
know, they said they dropped me off for some milk. I said, I'll be right back. I come back, they're gone. Mother.
Seven sisters.
Anyway, it's
Yeah.
like, you know.
Well, you know, on the point of universalism, I mean, the Seven Sisters, they're in like every group of mythologies around the world. There's stories of the Seven Sisters, and you know, very fascinating.
It does, and it is an impressive constellation. I mean, just as a learner, if you ever go out with somebody at night that's never spent time, they see this. That's like usually one of the first things they'll ask about. Like, I like the sky. I like to try to spend time. I try to go out with friends who haven't, and one of the first things is like, what's that? It's like, what's what? It's like a little dipper. It's like, that's the Pleiades. You know? But there is something that's really drawing to it, I find.
Right.
You know, I mean, enough as a kid, you know, knowing I can't be from here because everybody's so screwed, right? I gotta be from somewhere else. Where? There, that'll do. You know.
I hear that. I've always been Mark the Martian, just by, you know, namesake, but Pleiadian seems cool too.
For me as a kid, it was like when the first Star Trek came on and Spock was there.
Right.
I felt like, you know, they say like, you know, you finally identify with somebody. I was like, oh, okay, yes, finally.
Very cool.
Someone who makes sense, you know.
Right.
Anyway.
Right. I love that. I get that. I get a vague vibe of Spock from you, sir. So I'm wondering, you know, a big part of at least astrology is this association with the planets, and even
absolutely.
You know, doing certain things based on what energy is highest in the sky. Jupiter is up in the sky today, so I'm going to do something in conjunction with Jupiter. Did that come from alchemical workings? Like, did people find more success doing certain processes in those conditions?
I don't know. I mean, later on, I don't know because, I mean, here's the thing. Yes, it is used as a guide. It was used. You'll find charts for things, but once you get into it, you'll find rough guidelines, and they tend to be more seasonal. Like if you're doing the great work, start it at spring, and the reason is because that's when creation started. You know, all the planets lined up at the 0 point of Aries when God created the universe, and then he said go. And so that's the beginning of creation. So almost all the earliest alchemical texts, and that sort of tradition gets passed on. When you start the great work, you can start it at any time, you know, but you'll find greater success and greater ease if you work with nature.
Right.
So by starting in spring, you're working with nature.
Right.
But there are different, if you want to say astrology, there are different timing and planetary systems that are used in alchemy. So you will find, and particularly in medicinal, because they're trying to diagnose the disease, and on the basis of that, and astrology would be used for that, they can develop a medicine. But what I see happening in looking at like lab notebooks from the 17th century, they're not really timing things to certain events in the heavens. They're just getting on with the work and reporting on that. You go back earlier, you will find things saying, well, I cast a chart to go do this. This will be the best time to engage in that, right? So the answer is both kind of yes and no, because if you do a lot of this work, you can't be waiting, right? I mean, you can't be waiting for, 2 years from now with that particular. You might do that. You may set up knowing that's coming experiments around that, but you might still do those experiments anyway, right? But there are other timing systems. One of the ones I've seen in a Byzantine writing of the 7th century, Stephanos of Alexandria, he's describing the arrangement of the planets in the sky and how the moon is moving across them. And he says this is very much like the process in the lab as this unfolds in stages, right? So he's not doing measurements, right? He's not like figuring what sign this is in relation. He's looking naked eye and seeing where the positions of the planets are in relation to each other. It's not even like he's talking constellations. He's saying, here are the metals. So here's silver, right? It's approaching Mercury, and beneath that is the sun. Okay, and he goes, this is kind of what's happening in the lab right now. So he's connecting these kind of planetary things, and this is also how the metals are connected. In a lot of alchemical theory, the metals arise out of this interaction of the elements with an infusion of planetary force or energy. Right? So if Mars is dominant and the Earth is in a particular configuration and the elements are mixing in a certain way, you'll get iron. Right? And this goes back, as I say. So it happens very early on. So I mean, as you do these things, you'll find some of it going early with some shifting of identification of what planets are. But by the time you get to like 8th, 9th century, it's pretty fixed, right? And then by the time you get to Europe, it's done. It's, these are this is what the signs are. These are what the planets are. This is the metals it's associated with. Here are the herbs. Here are the gems. It's taken that time to kind of work that all out, but it becomes fixed.
Right. Now, on the point of maybe going back a little bit to the Emerald Tablet, I'm wondering if we can get maybe a little bit more of a 101 on this itself, because I've heard a lot of New Age people talk about this.
Everybody talks about
right,
this.
and I'm wondering, is there an actual piece of emerald? When was it carved? And like, what's the story? Where does this come from?
Here's what is like factual, right? That you can go say, okay, here somebody attested to this in this year, and this is what they wrote about. Okay, there's no material evidence for any of this, right? In terms of, is there a tablet? Is there a stone? Right? So what does that word smaragdina or asmarud in Arabic mean? Right? Is it emerald? And actually what the word points to is a green quartz, which was used in displays and things like this of great importance and of great beauty. It's a green quartz. So this is what they feel, if this was an engraving that was in existence, it wasn't on emerald, like a big, because it's also to a tablet made of emerald, Yeah, that would be a very large gemstone to work from. Not saying you wouldn't have it, couldn't have it, but the fact that within the mineralogy of the time period in there, there was this material that was quartz and was used, and you can get big sheets of it enough. So if it was, no evidence for it. So there are several stories as to how it was discovered, right? The one I believe that's the oldest is from an Arabic text from the 8th century, around 700 AD. And it's supposed to be an Arabic translation of a work of a Greek writer, Apollonius of Tyana, actually, of like around the 1st century AD. But this text exists in 800 AD. And what he says is Apollonius, I forget where it was, in Syria, maybe Damascus, somewhere in that area, because this is where Apollonius traveled and was around. And as generally as that story goes, is there was a statue in the square or somewhere, and it said, "I stand on the truth," or "I stand on wisdom," or something like that. And he passed the statue every day. And one day there was an earthquake. And so as he passes the statue, it's a little disrupted and there's a crack at the base, but he feels this very cold air coming up from it. And he looks and he sees there's a space, kind of opens this up a bit, and there's a stairway down, right? And he takes the stairway down, lights a torch or something, and sees there this statue of Hermes, and he's holding the emerald tablet in 2 hands. And in it, it says, "True, no doubt about it. The above comes from the below, and the below comes from the above. All things," this type of a thing. And it goes on. And it's basically a creation text. It's how the universe got started. It's how it operates. And it's how, in the original, sons of deception, this is how the alchemists were called, sons of deception, the theurgists, the thaumaturges, sons of deception. This is the method they use, right? That if you want to do a working of wonder, well, you follow that same working that the one that created the macrocosm does, right? Because all creation is the same. The father is the sun, the mother is the moon, so you get this idea of an alternation. The wind carries it in the belly, right? So you get this idea of this arising, this vapor that comes up, but the earth nourishes it. So this descent happens where then the earth brings it. And so the emerald tablet describes this. So it's both an alchemical process, but it's describing a more broad kind of creative process as well. And the thing that's interesting, the earliest version of it, most people I think who are familiar with the emerald tablet would remember the first phrase, or the most memorable phrase, is "the above comes from the below comes from, as above so below, as below so above," like this idea that whatever is going on is mirrored on earth, whatever is on earth is mirrored in the heavens. The originals, both in the Arabic and the Latin, actually say that the above comes from the below, and the below comes from the above. And so what it implies is a creation ongoing, each one dependent on the other, which is this intense cycling process that the universe recreates itself every billionth of a second, so to speak. And this fits in with the Hermetic philosophical atmosphere, or the writings at the time. The general is that the world was in constant creation, arising, destroying, enduring, coming, going, but it's this constant churning.
Hence the snake eating its tail symbol. Or
Yes.
even, I was looking into a little bit of speculative geology, and they're saying that the North Pole and the South Pole might work in this way, where the North Pole sort of is like a mouth, and the South Pole is sort of like the, everything comes out and grows back towards the mouth.
This is true. This is how a magnetic field can be thought of, is that it is this sort of cyclical loop sort of a thing.
Yeah.
It's also the plate tectonics, if you understand. It's there's the adduction and the induction, right? The Atlantic, they're spreading apart, and in the Pacific, it's going down, or vice versa. but it's that type of circulation. It's what forms clouds, right? That same idea is that the water warms, it transmutes into air, it rises, it condenses, and it comes down. And so in these circulatory processes, that's what goes on. Is that what's happening is an embodiment of all these forces, heavenly and earthly.
Right.
This is what alchemy does. It tries to bring them both in and activate them to the most. So,
Right.
but then there are two other sort of like stories as to how this was found. That this was really, it was found at the time. It was like Sarah of Abraham, biblical time. They found it. I forget what the other one is, but it's the same idea. Is that somebody went down into this cave or this underground passage and found a statue of Hermes with this tablet engraved upon which was this text.
Right.
And that's just something that gets repeated, but there's no material evidence for it.
Well, I asked because the first time I encountered this text was with the Kabbalion, which is, you know, written allegedly by the three initiates. And that was the reason why I bought the book, because I'm like, who are these three initiates? I got to learn about whatever, you know, they're so worried about.
There's a guy in the 1920s.
Right.
Right.
Well, and I wonder if you found, you know, working for Weiser, if you found out who those folks were. Was that just a gimmick to call themselves the three initiates?
Yeah, this was his way of putting this knowledge down and getting it out.
Right.
In a way that would, I mean, I don't know what his motivations were. I forget the guy's name right offhand. But I mean, here's the thing. This is like, I mean, this was when I was at Weiser's. This was like one of the big books. People were constantly coming in. There was that and a handful of other ones. I forget some of the names of them, but this was a big one. And quite oddly, I only read this for the first time about 2 years ago. It wasn't what I was looking for.
Well, you had your eye on the obscurities, I'm sure.
I had my eyes on like trying to find actual alchemical texts written by alchemists.
Right.
And this had a mental, spiritual aspect to it, which I was interested in, but not very much.
Right.
I mean, I was in other areas, but this just wasn't resonating.
Right.
And again, it was mostly because all of my time and energy was, you know, banging my head against Paracelsus. Okay, that kind of occupies your energy.
You needed some more meat to chew on.
But also, like working at Weiser's, I guess the fact that I looked at it, I read it, and I felt that it just didn't have what I was necessarily looking for at that time, right? And it's also one of those sort of things like I never went to the top of the Empire State Building until about 5 years ago, also, right? So it's one of those things like, well, it's always around. I have these more pressing things to do. Eventually I'll get to it. But here's the thing. It's like one of the big debates around it was knowing the authorship. I forget the guy's name, but it is. He wrote other books that are like, he quotes himself from his other books that he names himself with. There's a rhythm of the language. It's like, and it's acknowledged that this man is the author. And I can only imagine it's like two things. One, you call it that, protects you, right? And it adds a kind of panache as well as it's not about me, it's about the words.
Right.
So if you're thinking this is from some guy from upstate New York, right, that has some great insights and writes in this way, you know, John McSmith would have you, and it's like, oh, are you going to read up, well, the three initiates?
Right. It's almost like Don Juan and Castaneda, you know. Don Juan was his, you know, persona through the book, right? Yeah.
Right. And it's not to say that they aren't speaking truths.
Right.
It's not to say they aren't. It's just what the debates were, still are. It's like, is it hermetic? And it's like, well, yes, it is. It is of that stream of thought. It happens to be 20th century Hermetism, updated, modified, pushed into certain things with some inventions added in. But yeah, there are things that are very harmonious with the Corpus Hermeticum from the 2nd century AD. That it's like but you can't say it was written back then.
Right.
But him doing this is of that tradition.
Mm.
Because the Corpus Hermeticum compiled back then was ascribed to Hermes 600 years earlier. So, Hermes, what are you going to say? Trickster and thief. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And there's
you know,
Mercury again.
Yep. You got to keep your eye on him. He'll lead you on, and then what I like to think of, he's the one that will lead you to Hades and kind of leave you there.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, we've seen some movies like that.
Yeah, you gotta keep an eye on him.
Okay.
So yeah, it's all of this kind of a mix of practical stuff, mythology, history, in terms of trying to interpret and understand this kind of material.
Right. Well, taking it to maybe the opposite side of the spectrum, because obviously that is a tremendous amount of work, very beautiful. As you said at the beginning, there are museums that are taking this Emerald Tablet translation and putting in their collections. On the other side of the spectrum, you have these really cool zines, which I think are really a part of like the New York culture, like being in a city. I'm sure, like I said, I'm from Connecticut, so I don't live in the city, but going there, that's one of my favorite things is picking up little pieces of ephemera and bringing them back home, So tell us how this got inspired.
And this is, this was something I've been doing since the 70s. I mean,
right.
Smaller versions, things like this, kind of mad postings in neighborhoods, this sort of mad screes of visionary material stamped out and whatever. This whole thing of the zines started, I give talks through a place called Morbid Anatomy and some others, but this was a place where it was an actual physical location, Morbid Anatomy Museum in Brooklyn. And I would give talks on various topics. And I was giving one on the homunculus, which is artificial life. And I had agreed, I never gave illustrated talks because there's a lot you think of alchemy and you think, really great pictures, the mythical, but they're not on topic sometimes, right? It's like you could just show it, but it really has nothing to do with anything. So a lot of the earlier talks I would be giving, there were no images. But they asked for this one, do you think you might be able to? And it was like, homunculus. There was nothing, right? So I'm like, oh shit, committed to this. I really would like to try to do something. When I give talks, I get migraines from computers. So a lot of the talks I prepare are cut-ups, right? I will take things from printed out material I have. I will photocopy a quote from a book. I'll cut them up and I'll paste them. And I had a table laid out like this. And then all of a sudden I thought, this is like a whole fucking zine, right? It's like, I'll just make a zine, hand this out at the beginning of the talk, give the talk, and, pass an envelope around and make a donation. And as the talk began, somebody came in, saw this there, and was like, oh, cool, alchemy zines. And I'm like, interesting, right? So that went well. Right? I gave half the, whatever was left over, I gave, half of what was left over to the museum for them to kind of raise money with. I had them just for myself to kind of hand out to friends. A week later, the museum calls, do I have any more of these? They've been very popular. I gave another talk on dream. And again, what do you show for dream? So I did another zine that way. I did one on timing or the animation of statues. And at that point it was like, I got, this is what I'm going to do. Because what it was, something like the homunculus, this is something you come across as you read alchemical texts, right? Something about artificial life, a small recipe for one, always got my attention, right? Made a little note of it, started a little file folder on these oddities I'd come across, and never really thought I'd do anything with it. But that's what happened. Right? Someone asked for a talk on it, put it together. And so what a lot of these zines are, they're like mini documentaries. Right? It's all the kind of key material outlining the key ideas. They don't have a lot of answers as to what this is, but it has a lot of good starting points. I think of them as trailheads. So if you're interested in like alchemy and time, I talk about 5 to 6 different timing systems, like mansions of the moon, things like this, and how this ties in as well as times in. But I, you know, I don't have anything to prove there. I point out some things, but if you wanted to go deeper, the bibliography will, as well as that material. So there's a lot of opposing of questions that if I were to do a book, would be my, and that's exactly what kind of what they are. They're sort of a place to put all of my research notes in one place. So it's open anybody to pick one up and go do your own, you know, kind of research beyond that.
Mm. Yeah.
And you can pick them up at, well, all the stuff you can get through my website, kepripress.com, but also through a place called Printed Matter in New York. There's a website, Printed Matter Inc. Catland Books carries it.
I've been there. Actually, I think, yeah, Tara, we went there once. Catland, my girlfriend's sitting on the other side of the camera. Yeah, we've been there once.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, Brooklyn. Yeah. They just reopened and expanded, actually. Hi. They've expanded, and yeah, they carry my work. Bookie Wookie in Amsterdam. It's sort of like an artist book, ephemeral kind of a thing. And you really kind of put your finger on it when you said this is kind of like a, you know, an urban do-it-yourself kind of a thing. And I think it's that way because of the density of the population enables it. Right. It's kind of hard to do this. I mean, we're a city of 8 million here, so you know there's probably like 10,000 or 5,000 other strange people that would be into it, right? You know, so you know there's that base, and the internet has really expanded the exposure as well. So
well, and I think New York is a melting pot for this kind of underground occult culture, going back all the way to Crowley's days and before, when the Dutch came and named everything devil this and devil that because of what the natives were doing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it does. I mean, what is it? Madame Blavatsky, I guess, was living somewhere in the 40th Street. There are tours through here that kind of like will kind of point to the old, and that's it. It has always been here, and right now, a lot of it has kind of migrated, kind of decentralized, but centralized more in Brooklyn now. Back in the 70s, it was really in the East Village. Because everything, there was like nothing, everything was falling down, you know, so things were cheap because, you know, good luck to you to live here.
Right.
But there was a great concentration of, I forget who was it, there was a writer that said it was either rock and roll, drugs, or woo woo. He goes, those are and usually all in one person, right? So you were into drugs, magic, and you know, and music. And that was a sort of a thing. But the guy said it was like pretty much like kind of 3 camps with maybe an overlap to one of the others. And it pretty much does describe it, because there really were, I mean, there were magical wars here in the 70s.
Well, I mean, geez, Brian, you said you get migraines, so I don't want to keep you here too long. But with a sentence like that, I'm sure we can go on.
When
for
are you
a
gonna
couple.
go? Right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that references it, if like, I mean, I was never involved in any of these things, but you would hear it. There was always people putting whammies on other people. I mean, you just couldn't. But there is this. I mean, it's in any kind of community that kind of expresses some kind of an exclusivity to a knowledge and an expertise in things. You do start getting a pissing contest, let's say, right? Like I know more that. So in the 70s, there was a lot of hostility amongst people that you would think should be just sort of natural allies, if you know what I mean. You're kind of all like in the same, but that's it. You're all in the same pot. So each one is kind of, and it was called Dead Names is the name of the book. I'm looking off to the side because I was helping a friend with something and I referenced it also. Who's working on, he was also here, was living with a bunch of these folks in the 70s, and he's kind of doing a graphic novel memoir around it. But
Very
this is as I say,
yeah.
you know, as we broadcast this out to the world. No, this is just something that's getting worked on. But Dead Names is the name of the book, and it's by Simon. It has to do with the Necronomicon being published. It's the story of the publishing of the Necronomicon in the 70s.
Okay.
And he was deeply involved.
Right.
And so this gets into some of the characters, and there's sort of a chapter on the witch wars, as they called it then. And then how there was a sit down, you know, trying to bring peace amongst the covens and the sectarians. Oh yeah, it's wild here.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, then there's like the church. Anyhow, no, folks, really, this is. I don't know how good of a literary piece this is, but it is an interesting kind of history in a way of the writing of the Necronomicon. I don't know if you're familiar with that, right?
Well, yeah,
Necronomicon.
it's in the
Oh,
Barnes and Noble near my house, but
right.
I never
Well, that
bought
was
it.
originally. Do you want a little like that
Yeah,
was
please.
originally? Yeah, that was. Well, Dead Names kind of gives the full kind of story to it. Okay. I was working at Weiser's around the time, right? I left to go to school, but I'd come back often and visit the folks who were there. And I was once over, it was Jim Wasserman's loft, and there were a couple of people, other folks that were involved in publishing, and he was involved in editing for Weiser's at that time. And we're just kind of hanging out. I was visiting from upstate, coming from college, and he goes, take a look at this. We just got this manuscript in. They want Weiser's to publish it, but we're not sure. And it's like they claim it's the Necronomicon. And I was like, what's the Necronomicon? They go, H.P. Lovecraft. This is like me, like 20 something. Who's H.P. Lovecraft? It's like, okay, forget it. Like he's not an alchemist. Forget it. But it was like this sort of a thing. And part of it was, is this real? Right? That was the debate. So I read it, other people read the manuscript, and it was like, it has that ring of a coherent system, right? But is it really this book that was, it's like, I doubt it. And everybody was like, but at the same time, it felt like it had and this is what the writer of this book, Dead Name, says, is that this may not be a handed down thing from the Assyrian, what have you, but it's like many other magical manuscripts, like the Picatrix, for instance, that comes out of an Arabic, but an older kind of a tradition. There are things in it that point to and trace back to an older tradition. Might have gotten distorted, might have what have you, names might have gotten garbled. I don't think anybody is claiming it. But when you read this, you go, this seems like if you really went into it, you might be sorry. Let's put it this way: you might call up something you might not be able to get rid of. But not that I believe that there's any externality to this, but I believe that in these systems, where you put your mind and energize, well, that's what you kind of develop. So it may not be smelling like sulfur. It may be the crack addict coming down the street with a hammer in his hand. You know
Oh
what I mean?
man. Yeah, that's a New York moment right there.
Yeah, right. It's like, I'm gonna hurt somebody. It's like, oh shit, how do I banish this? It's like, well,
Yeah.
you called it up, you wanted to see badass, you got it. You know?
Wow. See, now that's just something I can't have expected to come across, but I'm so glad you shared that with me because yeah, I remember seeing that book and, being born in 94, internet
Mhm.
culture, the first thing I thought of when I saw that book, unfortunately, was an association to like school shooter,
Oh,
Columbine,
absolutely.
dangerous,
Absolutely.
and I
This is
was
what it
scared of it.
evolved to. Absolutely. This is what it evolved. The whole satanic panic of the 80s was like, I mean, that really spooked a lot of folks who were serious, normal individuals that were practitioners. It was like seeing the satanic panic kind of going on around, and it's like, holy fucking shit! This is like the rich witch hunts. These are innocent people here getting accused of like and going to prison for it. It's like, holy fucking shit.
Right.
Did you ever see the West Virginia?
West Memphis 3?
Yeah, West Memphis 3. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I have a friend who told me some very interesting things about that gentleman Damien Eccles, because he's gone on several podcasts and kind of
Absolutely.
reformed himself and talks about magic and whatnot for people. But there is a sort of suspicion I think people may reasonably have about him because of his association with that case. But obviously, that was a very inflammatory situation in the country.
Absolutely. I mean, and it just, so it does have that kind of a thing to it, where it becomes like, I mean, because it is extreme. I mean, it is when you read this and all the images and it's just like the diagrams, it's like, whoa, this is the real shit. But it's like, what do you, and again, in all of this, what I always say is, what is your point, right? What are you doing this for? Right? Is it the pursuit of wisdom? Are you, this is where in my mind, where great religions, philosophies all fall down, right? Is like where they start pursuing power instead of wisdom. And I think when you pursue a true wisdom, there's a kind of a natural power that accrues to that without you even trying. Right. And I think you can see that in situations where one calmly speaks the truth to something that the parties involved kind of like chill out and recognize somehow. Right. And it's like, again, to what end? Right? When one does alchemy, when one makes a talisman, and this is the thing that you would see in these so-called witch wars, how fucking petty and ego. And it's like, what is this about? Is this trying to kind of strengthen a so-called community that can maybe push it a little deeper, better insights into things? What are you up for? What is this? Is it just a game like, let me put a whammy on this guy so I can get the next promotion? Do you know what I mean? Is this a Rosemary's Baby situation?
Right. They want to have the most participants in their coven and, whammy some
I've
other
got the
coven.
real truth.
Yeah.
I have the real truth and they have a dangerous thing. And what they're saying is so wrong that if you follow them, your soul is going to be damned. Right. And this is why you need to follow this way. It's like, no, that's not how it started. And, come on.
Right. A battle of egos really is what it sounds like. Now, before we go, because we are kind of running out on our time here.
Sure.
You mentioned
time flies when you're having fun, yo.
I agree, and we definitely want to have you back on in the future. Maybe we'll even come down to New York City and catch one of your presentations if you still are doing those.
I am. Once we get back to kind of live action here, we're tiptoeing back to it. Morbid Anatomy has opened up, but because of the recent surge, everybody's kind of like, we got hit really hard the first time, so we understand when they go, you might want to wear a mask. Everybody's like, okay,
right,
I'm good. I got it.
Well, on this point of maybe masked alchemists, I want to bring up a part in your book. I think it's on, I don't read Roman numerals, but it's on a page, and you talk about different alchemists, some real and some imaginary, and a name popped out to me, Mr. Nicholas Flamel. And his association with Fulcanelli. And I hear this story of Fulcanelli being maybe just an imaginary alchemist. Is there anything more to that?
Well, it's like, I don't think he was imaginary. I think it's a pseudonym for someone real. I mean, someone wrote the books, right? He wrote 2 books, one Mystery of the Cathedrals and the other one known as Dwellings of the Philosophers. Fulcanelli, I'm speaking of. Right. Fulcanelli did live and publish in the 20s in France, Paris. I believe Paris. But according to legend with him, no one really knows how old he is. And he was seen, right? One of his followers, a man named Cancelier, who died in the 80s and was a student of his, right? Has said he met him later on, I guess in the 30s or the 40s, and he was looking much, much younger. And they had a discussion, they imparted some what have you, and then he disappeared again. And then some people say, well, it's actually the writings of Cancelier. And then others say, well, no, there's many different theories as to who he was as a real human being. But the work he writes about, right, is what was known as, or is known as, the flamel work. And what that's understood to be is a working on the great work, that the beginning materials are antimony, which is a particular metal. And there are ways you work it to purify it, which then goes on to purify mercury, which then is then seeded with various forms of gold and silver to make the philosopher's stone. And so flamel is both a historic character, but also a legend, okay? Because the name Nicholas Flamel actually points to a person in the 14th century who was a copyist, a scrivener, and had married a wealthy widow. And they had endowed some orphanages and built a church. So what happened is, in the first legends ascribed to him as an alchemist were written about 150 years after they were alive, right? And they ascribed the wealth as coming from alchemical practice. And it was written in the voice of Nicholas Flamel. And it's called On the Hieroglyphics on this one church, right? And it's encoding the alchemical process, and it's his writing. So in understanding this, you can come up with a process. And so Fulcanelli identifies it, as well as many other alchemists in the in between those time periods identify it as work with antimony, right? And there's a lot of contemporary work being done on it. So if you were to look up the dry way, right, is another way it's referred to, the dry way antimony. It's also what Newton was working on, Robert Boyle as well. It was, I would say, one of the main strands of, great work alchemy of the 17th century. There are other substances being used, but this is the Flamel work and Fulcanelli.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for tying a bow on that for me, because there was a little bit loose ends there, and tying up this episode in such a great way. I mean, Mr. Cotnoir, this has been really, so much fun for me, and really furnished a lot of the gaps in where I'm, trying to understand alchemy.
Fun.
Glad you did.
I had fun. So anytime you want to talk, let's do it.
Right on. So for folks listening who had as much fun listening, go over to capripress.com, right, to follow up with all your work. You've got the zines there, a couple books there, obviously the translation of the Emerald Tablet. Is there anything else folks can expect from you?
Yeah, if you there's a sign up list for announcements. I only send stuff on books and the talks I give. I have some talks coming up on myth and alchemy. One on the book, The Splendor Soulless, a 4-part class on the Splendor Soulless. And then I'm doing an online alchemy 101, right? 6 parts, kind of really getting into looking at alchemy through its development by examining particular alchemists. So we get the theory, you get the practice, and as well as the kind of time arc, and as well as how to get yourself set up doing some experiments at home. So you can kepripress.com, KHEPRI press.com. There's a sign up, do it. Check in with Morbid Anatomy Library, but really there's other places that are just too many. There's so many, too many to name. No, just go to my website, sign up. You'll only get stuff on books and talks. So
right on.
Right. So thank you, Mark. This has been a lot of fun. I mean, really.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really
it's
good questions, really good conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. That means a lot, especially considering this is episode 130. We're off to a great start. And I got to ask you, where did all the books go in Weiser? Because they moved, they went to Maine. Did they take all those used beautiful books that were in that basement to Maine
they're
with
on
them?
sale. They're if you go to Weiser Antiquarian, it's there. Yeah.
I got to ask
But
them for a
getting into the
catalog.
basement, that was that's a lot of people took jobs there just to do that.
Right.
So, anyhow, great talking to you, and we'll talk soon.
Right on. Well, folks
Be well.
listening, thank you so much, and have a great moment wherever you are in the now.